In this session, we are going to discuss the various research methods in social psychology. They are correlational method, experimental research method, and field study. First, the correlational method. It is a synonym for the association. Correlation refers to a group of indices that are employed to describe the magnitude and the nature of relationships between two or more variables. It is descriptive, but it cannot be employed to conclude concerning a cause-effect relationship between the variables in question. To understand the cause and effect, it is necessary to conduct a controlled experiment involving an experimenter, manipulated independent variable in which the subjects are randomly assigned to the experimental conditions. The correlation research strategy allows researchers to achieve the goal of describing and predicting. These strategies are used to describe the strength and direction of the relationship between two variables. It is used to establish the reliability and validity of measurements. Because the correlational method of research doesn't measure the cause of a phenomenon or event, there is no independent variable to manipulate. Hence, it is higher on external validity than experimental research method. It reflects relationships that exist in the real world, aiding in providing evidence for a theory. Types of correlations. The defining feature of correlation research is that neither variable is manipulated. It does not matter how or where the variables are measured. A researcher could have participants come to a library to complete a computerized backward digit span task and a computerized risky decision making task, and then assess the relationship between participant scores on the two tasks. Or a researcher could go to a shopping mall to ask people about their attitudes towards the environment and their shopping habits, and then assess the relationship between these two variables. Both of these studies would be correlational because no independent variable is manipulated. There are three possible results of a correlational study: a positive, a negative, and a no correlation. A positive correlation. It is a relationship between two variables in which both variables are moving in the same direction. Therefore, when one variable increases as the other variable increases, or one variable decreases while the other decreases. An example of positive correlation would be height and weight. Taller people tend to be heavier. A negative correlation. It is a relationship between two variables in which an increase in one variable is associated with a decrease in the other. An example of a negative correlation would be the height above the sea level and temperature. As you climb the mountains, increase in height, it gets colder, thus decrease in temperature. A zero or no correlation. It exists when there is no relationship between two variables. For example, there is no relation between the amount of tea drunk and the level of intelligence. Scattergrams. A correlation can be expressed visually. This is done by a diagram known as scattergram, also known as a scatter plot or scatter graph. A scattergram is a graphical display that shows the relationships or associations between two numerical variables or covariables, which are represented as points or dots for each pair of scores. A scatter graph indicates the strength and direction of the correlation between the covariables, that is positive or negative. Instead of drawing a scattergram, a correlation can be expressed numerically as a coefficient ranging from -1 to +1. When working with continuous variables, the correlation coefficient to use is Pearson's R. Correlation coefficients determining correlation strength. The correlation coefficient R indicates the extent to which the pairs of numbers for these two variables lie on a straight line. Values over 0 indicate a positive correlation, while values under 0 indicate a negative correlation. A correlation of -1 indicates a perfect negative correlation, meaning that as one variable goes up, the other variable goes down. A correlation of +1 indicates a perfect positive correlation, meaning that as one variable goes up, the other goes up. There is no rule for determining what size of correlation is considered strong moderate or weak. The interpretation of the coefficient depends on the topic of study. When studying things that are difficult to measure, we should expect the coefficient correlation to be lower. Example, above 0.4 to be relatively strong. When we are studying things that are much easier to measure, such as socio-economic status, we expect higher correlations. Example, above 0.75 to be relatively stronger. In these kinds of studies, we rarely see correlations above 0.6. For this kind of data, we generally consider correlations above 0.4 to be relatively stronger correlations, and those below 0.2 are considered weak. Correlation is not causation, means that just because two variables are related, it does not necessarily mean that one causes the other. A correlation identifies variables and looks for a relationship between them. The experiment can predict cause and effect, but a correlation can only predict a relationship as another extraneous variable may be involved that is not known about. Let's look at the strengths and limitations of correlations. Now, the strengths of correlations are: neither variable goes through a manipulative process, as it is the distinctive feature of this method. Two different data collection methods are available with correlation research. The information is straightforward, giving researchers access to specific points that can lead to a greater understanding of the potential variables involved in each situation. The results from correlational research are more applicable because a correlational research study occurs in a real-life situation. The data that gets gathered from this work is typically more applicable to everyday encounters. It offers a beneficial starting position for research. When a correlational research study begins to look at specific relationships or phenomena to see if connections are present, then the variables provided an excellent starting position to begin the review. Each variable creates a unique data set that can work in several different ways with known and unknown relationships. Researchers can determine the direction and strength of each relationship. This advantage makes it possible to narrow the findings in future studies as needed to determine causation experimentally as required. A survey method is helpful in correlational research, as some correlational research study methods can benefit from the use of these surveys to collect information on a specific topic. Since the variables being studied still aren't under the control of the researchers, then it can reveal the presence of a relationship between them. That makes it fast, easy and affordable to start looking for potential outcomes and results when studying specific contact points. The results of correlational research study are easy to classify. Next, let's look at limitations. Correlational research only uncovers relationships. The benefit of a correlational research study is that it can uncover relationships that may have not been previously known. Correlation does not equate to causation when using this study method. It won't determine what variables have the most influence. A correlational research study can help to determine the connection that variables share with a specific phenomenon. This means the correlation for a specific variable must be assumed or sent to a different research method to collect the necessary data. Correlational research can be a time-consuming process. Although the benefits of correlational research study can be tremendous, it can also be expensive and time-consuming to achieve an outcome. The only way to collect data is through direct interactions or observations of the variables in question. Extraneous variables might interfere with the information. There is no guarantee that additional influences will stay out of the correlational research study. It is possible for unique outcomes to exist that interfere with the work. Outcomes can be adversely impacted by the quality of the work. The quality of work performed during a correlational research study will determine the usefulness of the data gathered. Even though there is some flexibility in the structure of the study, a lack of representation in the selected sample can produce inferior results that could lead researchers down an incorrect path of study. Most correlational research studies are found in the field of psychology. It is treated as a preliminary way to gather information about a specific topic or situation where experimentation isn't possible for some reason. Although it typically looks at two variables to determine if a coefficient exists, it can also look at more in some relationship. Now, let's discuss about experimental research method. According to Fessinger and Katz, experiments are one in which the investigator creates the situation with the exact conditions he wants to have and in which he controls some and manipulates the other variables. An experiment is one of the most powerful techniques for studying variables under controlled conditions. In its basic form, the experimental method involves two key steps. 1. The presence of some variable believed to affect an aspect of social behavior. 2. The effect of such changes, if any, are carefully measured in an experimental method. One variable is changed systematically and the effects of these changes, one or more variables produces changes in another variable. Then we can conclude that there is a causal relationship between these variables, that is, changes in one do cause changes in the other. The factor systematically changed by the researcher is termed as an independent variable, while the changes in behavior observed in the other is known as the dependent variable. For an experiment to be successful, two key factors are required to measure the changes in the dependent variable caused by the independent variable. Firstly, random assignment of participants to the experimental conditions must be done. This means that all the participants must have equal chances of being exposed to each level of the independent variable. The reason for the random assignment of participants to the experiment is because later it will be impossible to determine if differences in this behavior are from differences they brought to the study or from the impact of the independent variable. The second condition is that for successful experimentation to happen, all factors other than the independent variable that might affect the participants' behavior must be held constant. But when the reason for the change or variance in the dependent variable is not clear, then the independent variable is said to be confounding with another variable. Given the complex nature of the behavior, such simple explanations to problems is not possible. The researcher is bound to encounter many hurdles before clearly establishing the causality between the two variables and prove his hypothesis to be true. Hence, to understand why one variable produces a change in another variable, the researcher further investigates to find out what other factors are playing a role in determining the relation between the independent and the dependent variable, and hence showing a change in behavior. Here, another type of variable is encountered and is known as the mediating variable. Once the researcher establishes what the mediating variable is, he then establishes a new hypothesis to be tested. He collects relevant information by choosing an appropriate tool to collect the data for further analysis. Once all the data is collected, he tests the hypothesis and decides whether to accept it or reject it or even modify it. The experimental process. Like other sciences, psychology also utilizes the scientific method and bases conclusions upon empirical evidence. While experimenting, it is important to follow the steps. First, finding a research question or a research problem. Next, defining a variable. An operational definition that describes exactly what the variables are and how they are measured within the context of the study. Variables are anything that might impact the outcome of the study. Next, developing a testable hypothesis that predicts how the operationally defined variables are related. Next, conducting background research, going through journals, articles, etc. Will be providing us information about what questions have been answered and what needs to be answered. Selecting an experimental design, the next step is to select that suits the study. There are three types of design that we can choose from, namely pre-experimental, quasi-experimental and true experimental design. Each design has its pros and cons, and we must select one that suits our research the best. Standardizing the procedures. To arrive at proper valid conclusions, it is essential to compare each participant equally. That is, each participant must receive the same treatment under the same conditions. The sample must be selected carefully to maintain the proof of participants is the same. We can choose them using a simple random sample and a stratified random sample. Next, conducting the tests and collecting data. Once the participants are selected, the next step is to conduct tests and collect data. Before conducting the test, we need to inform the participants about consent. Once we have received the consent, we can administer the test. Now let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages of research method. Experimental method is popular due to the fact that it is possible to take complete control over a single variable while conducting the research efforts. This process makes it possible to manipulate the other variables involved to determine the validity of an idea or the value of what is being proposed. The advantages are as follows. Experimental research offers highest level of control as it is possible to isolate specific variables to determine the outcomes. It is useful in every industry and subject. It replicates natural settings with significant speed benefits. Experimental research offers results which can occur repetitively, allowing to improve or increase the validity of research. Experimental method produces specific results, which allows to further develop specific solutions to problems. This research works with other methods also. This ensures accuracy. Experimental research allows for determination of cause and effect. Now, let's look at the disadvantages. Experimental research suffers from the potential of human errors, that is, level of control over the variable should be maintained to obtain meaningful results. It is a time-consuming process. Experimental research creates unrealistic situations that still receive validity because the experimenters fail to see the unrealistic situation created. Experimental research struggles to measure human response. Experimental research does not always create an objective view. It can experience influences from real-time events. Experimental research cannot always control all of the variables. It does not always seek to find explanation. It does not make exceptions for ethical or moral violations. It may offer results which apply to only one situation. The last method that we will be discussing today is field study. A field study refers to research that is undertaken in the real world, where the confines of a laboratory settings are abandoned in favor of a natural setting. This form of research generally prohibits the direct manipulation of the environment by the researcher. However, sometimes independent and dependent variables already exist within the social structure under study, and influences can then be drawn about behaviors, social attitudes, values and beliefs. It must be noted that a field study is separate from the concept of a field experiment. Overall, field studies belong to the category of non-experimental designs, where the researcher uses what already exists in the environment. Alternatively, field experiments refer to the category of experimental designs, where the researcher follows the scientific process of formulating and testing hypotheses by invariably manipulating some aspects of the environment. Prospective researchers must understand the types, aims and issues, the factors that need to be considered and the advantages and concerns raised when conducting the field study type of research. Field studies belong to the category of non-experimental design. These studies include the case study and in-depth observation of one organization, individual, animal, naturalistic observation, observation of an environment without any attempt to interfere with variables, participant observer study, observation through the researcher's submergence into the group under study, and phenomenology is the observation derived from the researcher's personal experiences. The two specific aims of field studies are exploratory research and hypothesis testing. Exploratory research seeks to examine what exists in order to have a better idea about the dynamics that operate within the natural setting. Here, the acquisition of knowledge is the main objective. With hypothesis testing, the field study seeks to determine whether the null hypothesis or the alternative hypothesis best predicts the relationship of the variables in specific context. Assumptions can be used to inform future research. Now, advantages and disadvantages of field study method will help us to decide when to use it appropriately. Field research may also uncover elements of people's experiences or of group interactions of which we were not previously aware. This in particular is a unique strength of field research. With other methods such as interview and survey, we certainly cannot expect a respondent to answer a question to which they do not know the answer or to provide us with information to which they are not aware. And because field research typically occurs over an extended period of time, social facts that may not even be immediately revealed to a researcher but that become discovered over time can be uncovered using this course of a field research project. Let's review the advantages and disadvantages to understand the value of field research. The major benefits of field research are as follows. It is conducted in a real world and natural environment where there is no tampering of variables and the environment is not doctored. Due to the study being conducted in a comfortable environment, data can be collected to conduct further exploratory and additional research about various topics. The researcher gains a deep understanding into the research subjects due to the proximity to them, and hence the research is extensive, thorough and accurate. It yields a very detailed data. It emphasizes the role and relevance of social context. It can uncover social facts that may not be immediately obvious or of which research participants may be unaware. Now, let's look at the disadvantages of field research. The studies are expensive and time consuming and can take years to complete. It is very difficult for the researcher to distance themselves from a bias in the research study. The notes have to be exactly what the researcher says, but the nomenclature is very tough to follow. It is an interpretive method and the subject is entirely dependent on the ability of the researcher. In this method, it is impossible to control external variables and this constantly alters the nature of the research. In conclusion, we can say that the next time we want to undertake any kind of research, we will be aware of all the advantages and disadvantages of the various methods available, and that once decided, we can conduct our research to find solutions to the various problems that we face as humans in this society.